Hey guys, welcome back to the Sisyphus 55 podcast. Today we're going to discuss schizophrenia as well as psychosis in general. Do you have any, before we begin, do you have any sort of specific interests regarding the disorder that you think we should maybe address?
Nothing too specific. I guess you probably know a lot more terms than I do, so let's go.
Okay. All right. Yeah. And before we begin, neither of us are clinical practitioners or have a PhD in anything. So apologies in advance if there's anything incorrect, because this is like a lot of material. And it's also like a field that is constantly churning up new research. And there's a lot of inconclusive evidence about especially like causal factors and treatments. But I guess broadly to begin with, we can discuss what psychotic disorders are. There's one kind of main one everyone knows about, which is schizophrenia. And then there's also schizoaffective disorder, schizophreniform disorder, delusional disorder, and then there's personality disorders. Schizotypal would be considered somewhat psychotic. Borderline can also be psychotic, and confusingly, schizoid generally isn't considered psychotic despite the name. But we'll get into that. So firstly, there's schizophrenia, and we'll use the DSM, the diagnostic manual used by the American Psychological Association to kind of define it, whether you like it or not, because there's a lot of there's a large anti-psychiatry movement that's not very for DSM. But it gives us like a broad outlook. So there's three main kind of issues that happen when schizophrenia emerges in an individual, and it generally emerges in early adulthood or adolescence. It usually doesn't emerge super early. There's hallucinations, which are very depicted. They're depicted prevalently in a lot of media with schizophrenia. There's delusions, and there is disorganized speech and thinking. And so the hallucinations. Can you think of any sort of I don't know, film or TV show where they try to depict hallucinations?
Well, there's actually one where this is personal opinion, but I actually think they did a really good job explaining the disorder, and it's in the biopic of Brian Wilson, Love and Mercy. And I think it comes out that he doesn't have schizophrenia. I think in the film they say he has paranoid schizophrenia, but I think he was just I forget what it's called, not schizotypal, but
I think he is considered like a famous person that like broadly has like schizophrenia. I don't know exactly what he has. And he's the guy that he kind of created the Beach Boys also.
yeah. But anyways, where I was going is that in this film, like if you think about, do you know the film like A Beautiful Mind about I forget his name, but he studied at I think Berkeley, and he had schizophrenia, and the way they depicted the hallucinations in that film is that they're like waking dreams almost, like these people show up, and it wasn't true for his case because he had auditory hallucinations. But in the biopic with Brian Wilson, they really show not like the kind of cliche elements of schizophrenia, but rather like the more intense kind of abstract parts of it. And what I mean by that is like there's this insane part where he's listening into his headphones and he starts hallucinating that there are, it's terrifying whoever put it together, but like these really loud screeching noises, all these voices, you can hear like his dad kind of yelling at him in the background, but it's like all in his head. And throughout the film, stuff like this keeps happening where there's like they're at a dinner party and everyone's like knives and forks are hitting like the plates, and there's all this noise and it starts amplifying and getting all distorted, and he has like a mental breakdown like at the dinner table. And then the other the other thing they do a really good job of is explaining like the delusional aspects of schizophrenia, like the type of like cognitive distortions or how you rationalize what's happening. They really show like how kind of vulnerable he was towards the end of like the mid 60s.
I think that brings up two really good points. One, even though it's like depicted very popularly in like films and TV shows, visual hallucinations aren't that common in
No.
those with schizophrenia. Auditory hallucinations are the most common, and they're even the most common, or maybe not the most common, but they even show up in those who have schizophrenia that are also deaf, which is interesting. And they think the reason why is because we have like the Wernicke's area and the Broca's area in our brain.
Yeah.
And the Wernicke's area is for, I believe, actually, I'm not going to say which one because I always get these messed up. But the Broca's area is more involved with. You know what? I have my computer right here.
Well, just while you're looking that up, is it Oliver Sacks that he came up with the like non-psychotic hallucinations?
I'm not sure. I'm not sure.
Or it might not be all of it, but I remember there was a case revolving that where a blind woman started hallucinating, and they were quite vivid, but the main point wasn't that she was blind. It was mainly that she was like completely aware she was hallucinating, so it couldn't be considered like psychotic. But
Oh,
yeah,
that's
it's
interesting.
interesting. People without those senses, all of a sudden, their brain can not give them sight, but give them some sort of like stimulus.
Right. Oh, that is interesting. Yeah, just because I didn't want to misspeak. So the reason why even deaf people can have like auditory hallucinations is, at least they theorize, is that it's not like an issue of like we're actively hearing these voices externally or something like that. It's we all have kind of inner thoughts, and we have kind of an inner monologue that usually sounds like ourselves. We can also bring forth voices of other people, like we can think of what our maybe our dad sounds like, or our mom, or close friends, and what they believe happens, because it looks like there's activation in Broca's area, which is the area concerned with the production of speech, that it's some sort of mislabeling where it's taking those inner thoughts we hear, but it's labeling them as external, like speaking. So and that kind of, it helps me kind of conceptualize exactly what these auditory hallucinations sound like, because I think the other thing is they're usually characterized as like these extremely like overly aggressive, hateful sort of dialogues, which can happen, but generally they're usually reported by those with schizophrenia as being at kind of normal conversational volume. Usually the voices are coming from people that they know, usually, and they're usually most severe when they're alone, which would kind of make sense. But overall, broadly, auditory hallucinations are an important element. You can get hallucinations in any cognitive area or in any sensory area in schizophrenia, but the visual is the kind of least prevalent. And the other thing you brought up with the delusions is the delusions, like in Brian Wilson's case, they can become very like systematic, where
Yeah.
because they develop these delusions sometimes to justify the hallucinations, and they'll end up like fully creating like a system of thought that sounds very eccentric to anyone looking at it, but
Yeah.
I mean they can be
Well,
incredibly complicated.
well, I think, well, first of all, I just looked up if it was Oliver Sacks and I couldn't find out, so apologize if that's the wrong person. But with Brian Wilson, what I think was going on and why he was like labeled a paranoid schizophrenic was at the time his family, who he made music with, was not really being very supportive with his ideas. Like this was around the time they were working on Smile, which never got made when it was intended to, and he was getting all these ideas for children's shows and and this type of music that didn't have any lyrics but just sort of noises, and it was, it was all based on a very pure idea. Like he just wanted to make people happy and stuff, but his brothers and his bandmates did not want to go this direction. They just didn't understand, and they didn't think other people would. And I think around this time he started, like in the movie they bring up he had a few delusions that like he was getting spied on by, I think in the movie they say it's like Phil Spector is who he's like afraid of, but I think he was just paranoid.
I mean, he had every right to be afraid of Phil Spector.
Yeah, we still do, but he I think he just felt that lack of support, and it made him start to think that like first his family was against him, his friends, and then it seemed like the world was against him. And I know that's typically like the main feeling of paranoia, is that there's a force against you, like just something is planned for you, I guess, that's not good.
The kind of three main ones. The first one is like there's external agents acting upon your thoughts. So either they're implanting thoughts, or they're deleting thoughts, like removing them, or they're like broadcasting them. And all of those that would be very terrifying for, I think, anyone to experience. And then there's also these ideas of reference where, we all do this, I feel like, a little bit. But like if you're watching a TV show or you see an ad and it feels like it's speaking to you, like it has some sort of specific significance. The thing is, they do it to like, it happens to them to like an overwhelming degree. And then there's also a common one is there's this idea that there's body parts that have been removed, like organs especially. And I think in the Rorschach test, that one where they show you kind of ambiguous figures, they used to, I don't know how like valid this is to find if people have like schizophrenic ideas or thinking, but if you saw organs and like blood and like the removal of organs like in those images, then you were considered to have like schizotypal thought.
I mean, about like the broadcasting thoughts, I was researching this artist, Brian Charnley, who suffered from schizophrenia up until he I think he killed himself, but he did all these self-portraits before he died. And one of the main things he was suffering from was that he believed that everybody else and other people could enter his mind, but he couldn't enter theirs. So he started to feel like he was like a broadcasted signal, but he didn't want to be that way. And just in the art, you can tell how this affected him, because they're self-portraits. They're supposed to be examples of what he thinks of himself or how he sees himself. And when this becomes really overwhelming, his self-portraits become very kind of less detailed in a sense, and they become very open. And just in a way, it kind of, like, there's no way I could imagine what that feels like, but in a way, I feel like that's a pretty good description for thinking that your head is just open to everyone.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, that's an especially scary kind of delusional disorder, because that's, the sort of area where we at least think we have some sort of privacy. And then, sorry, just because there's so much to talk about, there's also disorganized speech and thought, which is if you listen to someone speaking with schizophrenia, they tend to make up words. They're called neologisms, and they.
I actually didn't know about this.
Yeah, but the words sound right. Like maybe like you're saying like, oh,
Right.
yesterday I scazzled to the beach or something. Like they don't sound necessarily incorrect, but they do it regularly, and they also like the grammar is technically correct, but it is incredibly difficult to actually understand like the semantics like behind what they're trying to say.
I remember one of the hard things with identifying schizotypal behavior is that it's like sometimes someone just might be really eccentric, or
we'll get to
sometimes
that.
They're a little
And then so that's just kind of broadly the symptoms. One of the one little interesting thing to note also is that men typically have more severe symptoms, and they think that this is the kind of reason why men are more likely to have been diagnosed with schizophrenia, is because women might go to the clinic and present symptoms, and they might not be considered severe enough, and they might just be given like a mood disorder diagnosis.
Right.
So it shows, this isn't a perfect system, obviously. But that also, the fact that you're probably wondering, why would if a woman who's schizophrenic, why would she be diagnosed with depression? But we've only talked about the positive symptoms of schizophrenia, and positive as in there's the presence of something abnormal, so like hallucinations and delusions. But negative symptoms, which are considered to be a lot more harmful, are the absence of normal function. And that includes a poverty of speech, like apathy, withdrawn behavior, serious depression. It's these symptoms are also present in those with schizophrenia, and they can be incredibly debilitating. And it's one of the reasons why their life expectancy can be so reduced. Is just, it completely messes with their overall like functioning.
Well, yeah, I think that's one of the hardest stigmas to get past with schizophrenia is that because of certain films and stuff, you see people with this disorder as dangerous, hostile, and threatening. They're crazy and they don't know what they're doing, or they're evil. And well, unfortunately, that's the case sometimes. For the most part, people with this disorder are bedridden, or they never leave the house, or they're deeply depressed, confused, anxious. Like the internal parts of schizophrenia that, like, I guess aren't as obvious to anyone are probably the more scarier parts of it, I guess.
Yeah, well, you're totally right, because people kind of forget that there is, despite all the eccentricities, that there's a real human being that's suffering despite this. And if any of us were in their sort of phenomenological position, like it would just be like incredibly distressing. And sometimes it's actually good to use sort of objective research methods to really illustrate this. They use antipsychotics regularly to at least block out the positive symptoms of schizophrenia, so the hallucinations, delusions. And specifically what these do is that they act on on dopamine receptors, and I think it's like D2 receptors or something like that. And what like these PET scans show is that sure, it works. These antipsychotics remove the psychosis, or at least alleviate it, but the patient who's suffering from schizophrenia experiences a lot of depression and distress that
Yeah.
could be potentially associated with these antipsychotics.
Yeah. Well, I know that, like, and this is kind of maybe a bit of a stretch, but for people that are doing like psychedelics recreationally, I think, or in clinics, it's like benzodiazepines are used as like trip killers to like end it if it's going badly. But mainly what that does is it just kind of knocks the person out. And I think you could compare that to a lot of the antipsychotic medication in the sense that, yes, it does take care of the hallucinations and the delusions, but that person is not going to be able to function either. Like, it totally wipes them out.
Yeah, and it should be noted most treatments only work on the positive symptoms of schizophrenia. There's been very little sort of interventions found that can fix the sort of incredibly depressed, withdrawn behavior. Yeah, I guess we could talk a little bit about what are the potential causes of schizophrenia, which has been like an area of research for so long, and it's kind of flip flopped. And now, at least from my understanding, the sort of research perspective is that it's called a diathesis stress model, and the diathesis is a predisposition. So say there's like, oversimplifying, say there's like a gene that someone has that predisposes them to schizophrenia, which isn't the case because it's like an extremely complex genetic
Yeah.
sort of system that is potentially involved in it. But just for the sake of explaining this, there's one gene, and somebody is born, so they have a diathesis for it. They have that gene. Other people don't. But the gene alone does not cause or increase the chances someone has schizophrenia. It's only if the individual, to oversimplify things again, is abused as a child. And that's the stress. So it's a diathesis stress model. So you have a predisposition, and then you have a stressor that sort of unlocks the condition. And this is kind of an important concept to keep in mind, because the nature nurture argument is always embedded in a lot of these causal arguments about disorders.
Like, well, just reminds me too. Like, I know we want to talk about schizophrenia specifically right now, but also that like it can be triggered. But I've also seen that people without schizophrenia or any sort of like psychotic disorder who have went through like trauma or something can still suffer psychotic episodes, which
That's
is like it's a big part, like at least I think this is like pretty well known, but just that it seems to cause a split from reality to protect the individual, to make them not see what is so harmful.
That is actually, it's something that is, I believe, covered in the DSM-5. It's acute psychotic episode, and it's usually just lasts a few days. And then there is also, I think, alcohol withdrawal delirium is another one. It
Oh
can last
yeah,
3 to 6 days, and
that
the
one's
person can
crazy
go
because
insane.
yeah, you're pretty much in like a waking dream because alcohol blocks like the REM, so
And
you're just wandering
yeah,
around.
cocaine abuse has also, at least in neuroimaging, it appears very similar to people suffering from schizophrenia. Like, psychotic episodes can be induced in many different ways, not just because of this predisposition, but
But like the but there is like a I think for all cases there's like a trigger though, like a stressful situation or something that makes the brain go into that mode.
yes, that is sort of the. I mean, I agree with that. That seems to make sense. I don't know of many cases where people just kind of. I don't know. There's because it's really hard to argue for the evidence of something that's absent.
Yeah.
So if people present themselves at a clinic with schizophrenia and like there's no noticeable stressor, you can never really prove that there isn't a stressor, because
Yeah.
maybe it's something they're not entirely aware of. But going back to just sort of like the potential causal factors, some of like the genetic links, they do these genome wide association studies, and what they're looking for isn't like a specific gene, because that's a little bit they've kind of overall concluded, most research has concluded that there isn't like one gene that can cause it, but there's like you can look at certain patterns of genes, or certain areas of chromosomes or deletions of chromosomes that are associated with, I think what they found is certain alleles that also put people at risk for bipolar, or there's a certain variation or a certain spot on, I think like chromosome 22 or something like that, that it also is, it's linked to schizophrenia, and then immune functioning, which is important because they also think one of the prenatal causes of schizophrenia is mothers being like infected early on. They did a study with like an influenza. It was an influenza study in like the second trimester. If the mothers were pregnant and during an influenza epidemic, they would had an increased chance of having kids that ended up having schizophrenia. So like there's like a million different little causal factors, especially the biological. One of the main ones, at least on a neurochemical level, is it seems to be an increase of dopamine, at least in specific areas, which kind of makes sense. And they think it's because antipsychotics work against dopamine, and also L-Dopa, which is used to treat Parkinson's patients, increases the potential for psychotic symptoms. It's one of the side effects. So they're thinking there might be some link between dopamine and psychosis, and then they also
Right.
think it decreases glutamate, and glutamate is kind of there for helping the central nervous system function and keep things in balance. And then they also think that there's like a lack of inhibitory interneurons, which are they kind of reduce or they work on the excitability of things. And all of those
Right.
together, just to say that they seem to be linked to increases in stress. People with schizophrenia appear to not do well when there are stressors in their environment. And I think one of the best sort of explanations for this is cortisol, which shows up when stress activation occurs, is linked to dopamine and glutamate. And I mean, so you're looking at like there's certain hormones that are affecting certain neurotransmitters that are only affected when something in the environment happens. So at least those
Yeah.
are the kind of boring biological genetic things. I find them kind of interesting, but
Yeah. Well, I mean, it kind of helps pinpoint a little bit further what could be happening to cause the disorder. Like, yeah, and just to add on top of that, like, and I don't mean this in a controversial way, but like science describes reality. It isn't necessarily reality. It's a way of categorizing. So even if we do find every single chemical reaction that's involved with someone with schizophrenia, it's like it won't tell us why. It won't necessarily bring us the philosophical explanation we typically need.
yeah. Well, and that's why I think it's important we also turn to like kind of the psychosocial causal factors. And there's kind of some main ones. I mean, there's the infection one. There's like the prenatal argument. So there's like infection at second trimester, like I mentioned. There's also malnutrition. So when the Nazis they kind of blockaded the Netherlands at one point in World War II, it created a famine, and it increased the birth rate of kids with schizophrenia. And so they think that there's some link between like malnutrition and schizophrenia, at least at the prenatal stage. And then there's also, yeah, there's like RH abnormalities, brain abnormalities, stuff like that. But the more psychosocial things are interesting. There's, I think, one of the prevalent examples is people that are like first generation or second generation immigrants are very likely to suffer from schizophrenia compared to the general population. And what do you think some of the potential reasons for these immigrants to be more likely to be diagnosed with schizophrenia? Why do you think that might be?
Well, I mean, to like just think about like malnourishment, for instance. For that situation to occur, I think you need to be in a pretty stressful or somewhat traumatizing situation where you can't access food, you don't, if you can't access food, you're not sleeping well and all this stuff. And I think it just goes back to that idea of it's this immense amount of stress and trauma that can't be dealt with by the individual. So it's almost like an escape.
Now, the malnutrition, it's not when the child is born. It's actually in prenatal stages. So prenatal being when the baby has not been born yet, but there's like a fetus. So it's the
I
mother
just I
being
just
unable to. But you're
I
right,
just
yeah.
mean in some way I think that the baby feels the stress maybe. Like
Well,
I
yeah,
don't know.
maternal stress is also related to increased chances of having schizophrenia, and obviously the baby, even if it like wouldn't remember it necessarily, but it would be experiencing some levels of stress, like there's nutritional deficiencies and stuff like that.
Yeah. And there's the I always forget what it's called, but just the the more that like mortality or death is on the mind, you're more willing to like express your worldviews and stuff. And I think that with these people that are going through such stressful things. If they're constantly worrying about their family or death or stuff like that, I imagine there's going to be a point where the brain gets weird. It can't deal with it anymore, because if your brain's like constantly preparing for it to not exist anymore, like that's got to be pretty weird.
Well, I mean, for example, one of the potential explanations for why immigrants have a higher risk of having schizophrenia is that there seems to be a mediating factor with darker skin. Like the darker skinned immigrants, especially in more predominantly white countries, seem to have very high rates of it. And they think that it's potentially because of discrimination, which would
Right,
make sense
right.
because discrimination would increase stress, stress would increase cortisol, and
Yeah.
so that's you're totally right. I think the diathesis stress model seems to be more of a good explanation of the potential causes of schizophrenia than other things. There is also one interesting one. Those who are born to parents who work in the dry cleaning industry are more likely to have schizophrenia.
What?
And so they think it's because there's certain solvents used that sort of interact at like the prenatal and natal phase of
Oh, that's weird.
development that could increase the chances. So it's like there's all these like weird links that could play a role. There's early brain damage, stuff like that, but it's and then I think one thing we should discuss, and maybe we can be, talk about this after the ad break, is R.D. Laing and the whole idea of family and dysfunctional
Right.
families being a potential cause. But first we'll do we'll have a quick word from our sponsor. Support for the Sisyphus 55 podcast is brought to you by Manscaped, who is the best in men's below-the-waist grooming champions of the world. Manscaped offers precision-engineered tools for your family jewels. Manscaped just launched their 4th-generation trimmer, the Lawnmower 4.0. You heard that right, the 4.0. Join over 4 million men worldwide who trust Manscaped with this exclusive offer for you. 20% off and free worldwide shipping with the code Sisyphus at manscaped.com. Not to give any of my listeners an image they'd rather not have, but one area I tend to neglect is keeping the boys trimmed. Thankfully, I'm one of the first people to try the new 4.0 lawnmower from Manscaped, and I'm blown away by the performance. The craftsmanship and details are next level. Manscaped engineered the ultimate groin and body trimmer by focusing on intelligent functionality and an incredibly comfortable grooming experience. Their 4th-generation trimmer features a cutting-edge ceramic blade to reduce grooming accidents, thanks to their advanced skin-safe technology. I now feel confident shaving my boys. This upgraded trimmer includes a multifunction on-off switch that can engage a travel lock. It also gives you the ability to turn the 4000K LED spotlight on and off when needed for a more precise shave. The Lawnmower 4.0 even allows you to customize your trim through additional guard lengths with sizes 1 through 4. There's also wireless charging. It uses electromagnetic induction, which helps the battery length last longer. Get 20% off and free shipping with the code Sisyphus at manscaped.com. That's 20% off with free shipping at manscaped.com, and use code Sisyphus. Unlock your confidence and always use the right tools for the job with Manscaped. Okay, so the this was like a very historically prominent hypothesis of why people develop schizophrenia. It was, I think it's called the schizophrenic mother, which is a mother that is cold and aloof, and was for much of history blamed for why people ended up developing schizophrenia. And there's no evidence for this. And this was unfortunately, I mean, nowadays we talk about how over explaining things in terms of neurology and genetics and stuff is, not entirely honest about the reality of things. It kind of reduces things. The same way this sort of issue occurred, but flipped regarding families and social effects. And there was an anti-psychiatry movement in the 70s, led by Artie Lang, who he believed that that schizophrenia was a sane reaction to an insane world. And so he specifically was against the genetic biological models about schizophrenia as being like inherited. He argued they weren't accepted by leading medical geneticists. And he argued that the person with schizophrenia was simply the scapegoat of a dysfunctional family and was paradoxically often the most sane person in the family group. And here's a quote
Ovid from Community.
Yes. He says, without exception, the experience and behavior that gets labeled as schizophrenia is a special strategy that the patient invents in order to live with an unlivable situation. And so it's like if you know about the personal life of Artie Lang, he had a very dysfunctional upbringing, and he also suffered from schizophrenia, or episodes of it throughout his life. And I was reading this off of like a website that was written by somebody with schizophrenia, and they said they don't agree with this because it really paints a lot of the schizophrenic symptoms as almost positive. And he goes on to argue that psychosis could be positive and life-enhancing in some cases, which a lot of schizophrenic patients would say it's very troubling to deal with these, both the positive and negative symptoms.
I see like a big kind of thing in the past year or two, especially with the kind of renaissance of psychedelic research, is that people kind of get the idea in their head that with like kind of pseudoscience or spirituality that schizophrenia or psychosis can be kind of magical. And I believe that to a certain extent, but I would never like want it on other people, because I have seen people write about it that have the disorder, and it's clear that it's not, there might be that one element where it's kind of cool, but it seems like it's mostly just hell.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that Artie Lang, like, there was still use to his argument. Like, he was saying like we shouldn't be so reductive, and we should be more open about at least like psychiatric diagnostics and stuff like that. But this, I agree with you that there is kind of a, going back to how it's depicted in media, we both kind of dehumanize those with schizophrenia, and also kind of find their psychosis as intriguing or eccentric or interesting, and not so much distressing and potentially maybe something that should be a target of empathy and compassion.
In Man and His Symbols by Jung, and like there's a introductory book on Jung where they go over a few of his analysis of patients, and it's it's hard to see schizophrenia as this terrible thing when you have these examples of it providing people with very like spiritual epiphanies, or like these kind of self-realizations that help them. But there are so many examples of it though just ruining people's lives and relationships, and so it's like just curiosity is probably the best way to go about it.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, one of the problems is your cognitive capacities are insanely in absolute dysfunction if you have schizophrenia. Like you have a lot of issues with like working memory, and you have a lot of sensory gating issues with hearing, and a lot of eye tracking issues, and just basic performance. So in order to be curious, you need to have some cognitive ability. But if you're just getting all this random stimuli in terms of hallucinations.
I meant like in terms of our reaction to to schizophrenia. Like, I think we should just keep like an open mind and stay curious.
Yeah, yeah.
Whatever helps them, I think they should do that.
Okay, yeah. We'll talk about Jung in a moment, but just going back to family as being a potential cause. So, despite the fact that the sort of Lang's family theory didn't really endure, there is definitely evidence going back to the diathesis stress model of causality with schizophrenia that family does play a role. Obviously, just broadly, if you have a stressful family environment early on and you have some sort of biological or genetic predisposition, it's likelier that you'll end up with some schizophrenic disorder. And specifically, one of the best examples of this isn't in the development of it, but in the relapse. So there isn't really any treatment that exists that can cure someone of schizophrenia, but there are various interventions that can be used to alleviate the symptoms, especially the positive ones.
Well, I know one of the biggest one is just recognizing trying to recognize what's actually real.
Yeah, that's a good one.
So, like, I think the whole thing with like, again, I forget his first name, but from the movie A Beautiful Mind, something Nash, the way he was able to deal with it in his later life was after shock therapy and experiments with medication. It just became clear that he needed to just start being aware of what was real and what wasn't, so he could kind of choose to ignore it. But I mean, for someone in that situation to actually get that much control over it is like astounding.
Well, just quickly on the topic of treatments, one really interesting one is exercise. Exercise is as we were talking about, the potential that inflammation and immune functioning is linked to schizophrenia. So exercise reduces inflammation, and it also reduces neurogenesis. And those with schizophrenia, they have enlarged ventricles, which means they have reduced gray matter in their brain. And this comes up even if you have two identical twins, and one of them has schizophrenia and one of them doesn't. That both of them will still have enlarged ventricles. So exercise, it increases inflammation, and regarding ventricles, it also increases neurogenesis and decreases cell death. So it'll reduce the sort of brain abnormalities in reduction of gray matter. So, and I mean, exercise is just generally good for most people and can help most disorders. But going back to the family thing, is that they get treated and then they come back, and there are very high rates of relapse in those who go back to family environments after they've been treated. So their symptoms reoccur, and they were kind of trying to figure out why that is. And what they looked at was this one concept called emotional expression. And emotional expression is how family members talk about the patient or individual of interest to a clinician privately. And there's three sort of dimensions that they look at. It's, do they talk about them critically? Do they talk about them with some hostility? And do they appear emotionally over-involved? And with criticism being like the most crucial, it looks like families that are high in emotional expression, so high in criticism, emotional over-involvement, and hostility, those patients with schizophrenia also experience the highest rates of relapse. So it does appear that families that are dysfunctional, they have some sort of communication deviance, they have this sort of hostility and criticism in how they interact with each other, it really increases the chances that the outcomes won't be very good for the patient. And this goes back to stress. They show very poor resilience in the face of even moderate stressors. And you can imagine being surrounded by a family living there, and they're constantly getting upset, and like I think it's like very obvious that this is something that would happen.
Yeah. Yeah, just causing that split. Like the brain just wants to flee.
And the other thing is regarding cultural differences. This doesn't seem to be the case if you look at less industrialized countries. More industrialized countries tend to have high rates of emotional expression in families, and less industrialized countries tend to have better rates of remission, better outcomes for patients with schizophrenia. And they think it's largely linked to the fact that these families tend to interact in less hostile and critical ways.
Yeah. No, that's really interesting.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, Artie Lang wasn't, entirely wrong. And his criticism of the way psychiatry was treating the illness at the time was, I think, valid because it was very reductive. And I think just regarding causality and schizophrenia, it is insanely complicated, and there's like a million different factors. And I think it speaks to the fragility of our consciousness and our minds, and just any one little thing can offset this incredibly brilliant system, and it could end in like an utter collapse in our ability to interact with reality.
I was just gonna ask a question about something I've been thinking about, revolving schizophrenia and psychosis. Because I remember I did some research on, I think it was meditation, sleeping, psychedelic use, trances, and like kind of spiritual psychosis, I guess, and then schizophrenia and psychotic like disorders. And what I found is that with sleeping, right before you fall asleep and when you're dreaming, the default mode network part of the brain is almost disabled. In psychedelics, which some people have said is like a psychotic like state, the default mode network is also disabled. Same with meditation and like in deep meditation. With psychosis and schizophrenia, however, the default mode network, instead of being off, is actually overactive. So, because there's such kind of similar states, at least in my opinion, all of those examples, why do you think that schizophrenia and psychosis specifically has such a different reaction in the brain?
I mean, regarding like the anatomical reason why is that the schizophrenic patients show reduced white matter volume in their brain, and white matter is like, you can think of it as like cables have like the, I don't know, plastic or rubber around them that kind of insulates them, and it also makes them move the electrical signals more quickly. In the same way,
Neuroplasticity.
yeah, sort of like the myelin sheath that goes around our neurons. It like insulates them, and it like helps the signals go faster, and it kind of nourishes them and everything. So to have reduced white matter is bad, because that means you're going to have problems with connectivity. And this is we're going to see specifically with the default mode network the disassociation pattern of functional connectivity of the subsystems in the default mode network. And that's the kind of anatomical reason. So, I mean, broadly, people that are doing psychotic drug or doing hallucinogenic drugs and stuff like that, they're probably not going to experience that. But there does seem to be like anatomical connectivity issues with the default mode network. And I mean, the fact that it's altered is, I think this is like a fairly new area of research. But I think one of we can think of it in terms of like hallucinogenics. You're gonna see like increased curiosity. Probably you're gonna be like kind of excited. You don't really consider, unless someone's having a really bad trip, usually you're gonna be like pretty interested. You're gonna be thinking a lot. It would be higher energy levels. But with schizophrenia, one of like because there's the negative symptoms is that you see withdrawn behavior, or kind of usually they're withdrawn from reality. They usually disassociate from other people. So I think it kind of makes sense. It's like characterized with the condition. But yeah, I don't know if that helps.
Yeah, like cuz I remember it kind of threw me off cuz I originally thought that I was kind of onto something, like they were all kind of leading to the same state. But I found out that the default mode network in people that let's say are working like really mundane jobs and they're constantly, that inner monologue is just super loud, like they're not actually focused on what they're doing, or people that are really stressed, anxious, or depressed, their default mode network activity is also up. So I think it just goes back to like the stress thing, but I just found it weird that that part of the brain that seems to be associated with the kind of strange connections and weird perceptions and stuff is overactive in schizophrenia.
Yeah. Sorry, I think I misspoke. It's an overactivity of the default mode network that could still be explained by just kind of the disconnectivity they have in general brain regions.
Right.
But yeah, I mean, this is like a fairly new area of research.
Yeah.
I think that you brought up dreams. It's kind of an interesting thing or interesting individual to discuss that you also brought up before is Carl Jung, and his conception of psychosis and dreams, in that schizophrenia is a type of waking dream. That, they tend to see somewhat familiar faces. They tend to have kind of random sequences of hallucinations and thought patterns, and but the only difference is that they're awake, they're in the world, and I mean, there's obviously going to be impaired functioning, and the fact that Jung also differentiated neuroses from schizophrenia, in that
That was
neuroses,
big.
yeah, he typically typically in neuroses it's like very familiar faces, it's people you know, but with schizophrenia, he, at least in when he was discussing with his patients, he discovered that a lot of them were hallucinating voices and sometimes images of mythological figures or religious figures. Sometimes these patients had no specific link to the religious figures or mythological figures that were being addressed. From this, he came up with his theory of the collective unconscious, which I'm sure most people know about now.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
I mean, yeah, he kind of characterized it by a split in the self, and that it. I can't remember the exact description. I just remember that he referred to it as like a split. But yeah, reading Man and His Symbols, it's amazing the amount of dreams that they analyze, in the sense that all these all these things that they've never seen before in the dream, after analysis, actually refer to something that is known, and it's kind of what I was trying to get to in my research, was that, like, in these kind of free, fragile states of the mind, when you're dreaming or hallucinating, that your brain won't find the exact, I guess, depiction of what it wants to tell you, but it'll find several symbols, as he called them, to kind of create that message, and it's up to you to analyze it and figure out what it's trying to say.
Yeah, I actually think in a way Jung's idea of schizophrenia was a little bit more nuanced than Lang's, even though he came a little bit before him.
Yeah.
He still kind of believes that these people are suffering a great deal, and he thinks that you can definitely develop some sort of information about the hallucinations and delusions. But I think that he actually, in comparison to a lot of the ways that psychiatrists historically treated schizophrenic patients, he gave them a lot more empathy and tried to see them as people experiencing a great deal of distress, with some very novel and eccentric symptoms rather than these crazy maniacs that are completely gone and we should just like lock them up in a ward.
Yeah, like, well, I mean, well, essentially, like, anyone that is split off from the shared reality is going to feel quite alienated. And if people in that environment also reflect that, like, they also stop talking to this person, like you said, they want to, like, lock them up or something. Young really helped because he once again showed that, like, no, there's someone under all of this, going through all of this. This isn't, like, the person. So yeah, it was really good to see that someone was a little more willing to help these people.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to kind of summarize this discussion. I do think just before we end this, maybe just for the sake of clearing some things up, because there's a lot of different sort of schizotypal disorders, is maybe just run through them really quickly, because we've spent this whole episode talking about schizophrenia, but there are other disorders. There's schizoaffective disorder, which is extremely crippling, but also the reliability of this actually existing isn't great because there's not a lot of measures to look at it. But schizoaffective disorder is basically the presentation of schizophrenia with...
I think that's the one that Brian Wilson had. I was getting it confused with schizotypal.
Okay, because schizoaffective disorder is it's the presence of schizophrenia with mood disorders. So it's either like manic states or depressive states or both.
Yeah, that's what I was. That's more Brian Wilson.
Okay, yeah, because that can be extremely debilitating.
Yeah, I mean, he was in bed for 3 years, so there's the evidence.
There's a schizophreniform disorder, so it happens. It's basically schizophrenia, but it's just it occurs with within 6 months and doesn't extend beyond that. So sometimes people can have it for a short duration of time, usually due to stress and some genetic predisposition. There's delusional disorder. And so that's people have these delusions that last for at least 1 month, according to the DSM criteria. And they are, aside from the delusions, they are completely fine with functioning. They have no impaired cognitions or anything like that, but they like have insane delusions. And I mean, I'm thinking not to really bring this up a lot, but I think in the current like political climate, because the whole idea of misinformation and what is true and what is not is becoming an increasing issue. I wonder how much this disorder is going to still maintain some sort of validity, because you can't really draw political lines when doing diagnostics, and if certain people are saying one thing is one way and certain people are saying one thing's the other way, and it's so deeply divided, when is it a delusion? A delusion is when like a general amount of people agree that something isn't what it is.
Yeah, like, I mean, this might be a bit different, but it just made me think, what's the difference between like, I know there's a difference, but specifically, what's the difference between a cognitive distortion versus a delusion?
Well, I think that it would be more useful to compare a cognitive distortion to a hallucination, because I mean, I guess cognition, because that is no, you're right, because cognition is more to do with like thinking patterns. Cognitive distortion. I mean, you could argue that a delusion is a cognitive distortion, but a delusion is like long lasting. It'll last for like a month or like longer. But there is actually one specific one in delusional disorder, one subtype that's interesting called erotomania. And
Sounds
that's
sick.
yeah, it's when people have like an unhealthy level of attachment to a figure of higher status who doesn't know that they exist. So like I think a good thing to imagine is like a teen girl.
We've all been there.
Yeah, we've all, everyone's had that. Like at least when they're kids, they become obsessed with like a celebrity. This is like where it becomes an issue, is when it like impairs their functioning and leads to some distress.
Is this like the people that say like like we're gonna get married as soon as he sees me, or like he
Exactly. No,
loves
that's
me but
exactly
doesn't
it.
know it yet. Oh,
That's exactly it.
hilarious.
They usually believe that they are like the one for whoever they're obsessed with. And yeah, I don't know. I thought that was interesting. But those are the psychotic disorders, and then there's personality disorders, which I don't know. We don't have to go into wild. The DSM is like made usually for insurance purposes, so explaining all the different categorizations isn't like a huge issue here. But the two main ones that kind of concern schizophrenia is schizotypal and schizoid. Schizotypal is basically a less severe form of schizophrenia. It's usually some sort of high levels of introversion. You have eccentric, strange behaviors, and
It's like magical thinking, right? Like you
you
think.
generally, yeah, people generally believe that they have superpowers or have some ability to do magic, which is, yeah, it's
Like they have a
interesting.
stronger connection to the laws of the universe than anybody else, essentially.
Yes, but they share a lot of like the hallucinations and delusions of schizophrenia, and they also share a lot of the cognitive issues. So the difficulties in like eye tracking, difficulties in response time, and stuff like that. So there does seem to be some sort of maybe genetic component or brain abnormality that link the two. And then schizoid is not necessarily as related to schizophrenia, at least from my knowledge, but because of its like similar name, I think it's important to bring up. It actually means somebody that does not want to have any sort of social relationships. They are very, very like isolated and just do not like the presence of other people. So imagine like the absolute highest level of introversion, and not to be confused with there's avoidant disorder, which is you do actively want social relationships, but you are absolutely afraid of criticism. So you have this awful feeling of constant loneliness because you can't really approach anybody, even though you really want to. But schizoid,
Yeah.
I mean, you can imagine, I guess, like the Unabomber would be a good example. He, at no point in his life, appeared to show any sort of inclination to get in any sort of relationship.
Well, it's
And
kind of
yeah,
it's like paired alongside like an absolute infatuation and obsession with like your own internal ideas or world.
yeah, there usually is some component to fantasy thinking. Maybe not to the same
Yeah.
degree as schizotypal, but there
Yeah, but
is,
just
yeah.
like you like how you see and feel everything compared to how it might be different.
Well, I think there's a, like Power by Kanye, like that song,
Yeah.
and there's like the 21st Century Schizoid Man. That's
Yeah.
that's probably one of the most popular ways it's like brought up is like you they're called like King Crimson. They were this like progressive rock band. It's from where the sample came from, and
Yeah.
yeah, and they're discussing specifically the issues, the consequences of the Vietnam War on Americans. And when they're saying 21st century schizoid man, they're talking about somebody who's apathetic, emotionally cold, and they tend to live in a fantasy world.
Wow.
And it could be caused by unloving, neglectful parenting, and instead they're kind of saying that it's caused by the damages of the horrible war in Vietnam, especially on like soldiers and like their kids, and
Right.
how people are just going to turn progressively inward due to the heredity of it all. Just as a little side note, but it's a good song. Is there is there anything else you'd like to add?
Um no, I think we covered it about all. I feel like the personality disorder's got to be its whole other thing.
Oh yeah, well I mean like even alone there's the issue of evil and psychopathy and antisocial disorder,
Right.
and I think that could be its own thing. Narcissism. I mean like the personality disorders, whether you find like the classifications useful or not, it is interesting that there are certain patterns of behavior and thought and personality that maybe we all somewhat relate to, but these are like extreme versions of it, and you can kind of see what could cause that. What sort of thinking, behavior do they have? Can it be treated? And then also at the end of the day, remembering that whether how interesting we find these disorders, these are real people dealing with legitimate distress and issues. But
I mean, yeah, that's. I was just gonna say, I think the majority of people have seen like all of the true crime documentaries on Netflix about like the Night Stalker or all these serial killers, and yeah, definitely they become kind of I don't know, larger than life figures. So it's kind of hard to remember that there are just normal people going through these same symptoms. That it's just
yeah,
terrible.
yeah, no, I mean, let us know if you want us to discuss more of these disorders, or just psychology in general. But I think that pretty much does it for this episode.
Yes, sir.
All right, peace.